Hello, my name is Shawn Hawkins. I'm an associate professor in the Biosystems Engineering and Soil Science Department at the University of Tennessee. Today I'm going to be presenting research that I'm conducting here at Milan. It's going to be on using broiler litter to produce corn and soybean in rotation. In particular, we're going to emphasize how we can replace potash and DAP in a corn and soybean rotation using litter.
There's a lot of interest in using broiler litter or poultry litter as an alternative fertilizer, particularly in Northwest Tennessee. Here I've got a map of the state that shows integrated broiler companies along with primary breeder companies. And you'll notice that in Northwest Tennessee, in Obion County and in Gibson County, there are two Tyson facilities. That's in Union City and also Humboldt. Litter is readily available in those counties and in surrounding counties. In our primary corn and soybean production region in Northwest Tennessee, most of the farms that are going to be raising poultry are going to be broiler farms. These are meat chickens that are processed at facilities such as what we have, Tyson and Union City and also in Humboldt. I've got here some characteristics for broiler litter as a fertilizer. It's a 3-3-3 fertilizer. In essence, it contains about 60 pounds of nitrogen, 60 pounds of P2O5, and 60 pounds of K2O per ton. That would be as is delivered to the farm. There is some variability between farms, of course, and there are farms other than broiler farms, such as breeder farms, and we also have pullet farms. So I asked for a representative analysis. The important thing to realize with broiler litter is that the nitrogen is only about 50% crop available. Very little of that nitrogen will carry over to the next crop year. But with phosphorus and potassium, we can really assume about 100% of it is available, and we can count on those nutrients to carry over into additional crop years. So the utility and the value of broiler litter is largely determined by the soil test. And if you have a soil test that calls for phosphorus and potassium, then those mineral nutrients add value to the litter. So if we add up all of the primary nutrients in broiler litter, that's nitrogen, P2O5, and K2O, and we use today's prices, which are very high, of course, for these nutrients, the litter is worth somewhere around $130 per ton.
This table shows data from Northwest Tennessee on the crop phosphorus and potassium removal rates for our four primary row crops: corn, soybean, wheat, and cotton. This is limited to the counties that are going to host the majority of the poultry producing farms for the two processing plants in Gibson and also in Obion County. Basically what I've done here is I've taken an approximation of the corn, soybean, wheat, and cotton, what the parts of the plants that are harvested, and we're emphasizing, of course, in this presentation, corn and soybean grain, multiplying the concentration of phosphorus and potassium in the grain by the yields. I think the data I used was for 2019, and what we have here is basically the number of million pounds of P2O5 and K2O that are removed in these crops, and I'm going to total those on the next slide and show you really the magnitude of the importance of litter being able to supply mineral nutrients, in particular in Northwest Tennessee for corn and soybean. To really emphasize the importance of broiler litter as an alternative fertilizer in Northwest Tennessee, I've got the litter mineral supply here. So that would be the amount of P2O5 and the amount of potash that is supplied in litter that will be produced in the two complexes in Northwest Tennessee. That's about 11 million pounds of P2O5 and 11 million pounds of K2O. I've got the corn and soy grain removal of these two nutrients listed on the left here. That comes from the prior table that I showed you. And so the litter can supply about almost 20% of the removal of P2O5, what's removed in corn and soy grain harvest. That represents a value of about $11 million. And for the potassium, that represents about 15% of removal, or a little over $7 million in retail value. And of course, I'm not counting here the nitrogen, which would represent a value of approximately $5 million in retail. The point being that litter is an important supply of mineral nutrients in Northwest Tennessee. So today what we're really emphasizing is corn and soy production and rotation. And so I've got listed here what my recommended litter fertilization strategy is for corn and soybean rotation. I think the best thing to do is to apply about 3 tons per acre of litter to corn at or just before planting. That will safely supply all of the starter nitrogen for the corn and about 2 or 3 years worth of phosphorus and potassium grain removal. Or if you have a soil test that calls for phosphorus or potassium, it would supply what would be needed even for low testing soils. And then you would follow that up again with corn, yield-based, a V6 nitrogen application as commercial nitrogen fertilizer. Of course, corn nitrogen demand is very high. Following V6, it could be as much as 6 or 7 pounds of nitrogen per day, and so that needs to be supplied not with an organic fertilizer that's slow release, but with a commercial fertilizer. And I think the reason this is a good strategy, I've gotten an N-uptake curve here for corn, and you can see that the N-uptake rate through V6 is very low, only about 25 or 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre. That's a good scenario for using litter as a fertilizer to supply that nitrogen. And for high-yielding crops, of course, the University of Tennessee recommends that we split nitrogen applications. So this makes for an ideal scenario for using litter as a fertilizer, applying it at planting, and then following up with commercial fertilizer at V6. I've got 2 studies ongoing at Milan. I'm going to present one of those studies in this slide here that shows that the recommended strategy works for fertilizing corn with litter. What we've got here is basically 5 different treatments. The treatments received either litter at planting 3 tons per acre or phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur according to soil test and recommendations, and 80 pounds of nitrogen. All those would be at planting. And then along the top you can see the V6 applications of 0, 70, 100, 130, or 160 pounds of nitrogen. And what you see in this plot is that those plots that were fertilized with just litter at planting, with no additional phosphorus, potassium, or sulfur, or nitrogen, produced corn with an equivalent yield as the plots that were fertilized just with commercial fertilizers. Continuing with another graph of that same study, again where we're putting litter or commercial fertilizers down at planting, and then we're following that with different application rates of commercial nitrogen at V6. I've got here the ear leaf nitrogen concentrations. That's and one of the leaves that we collect at R1, growth stage R1, following tasseling, and we quantify the nitrogen in the ear leaf, and you can see that the ear leaf nitrogen concentrations are equivalent whether we're using litter at planting or phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, and of course the 80 pounds of commercial nitrogen. So ear leaf nitrogen is sufficient so long as you're fertilizing the corn with nitrogen at V6 according to your yield potential. Now I'd like to shift to another study that we're conducting here at Milan. These is again plant tissue nitrogen concentrations, but in this study, instead of only producing corn, we're looking at corn and soybean being produced in rotation. You can see that we have 2 plot sites. Plot site A is on the top and plot site B is on the bottom. You can see that we have a variety of treatments. NC is for negative control. That's corn that is produced with mineral fertilizers being applied, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur, but no nitrogen is applied either as litter or as commercial fertilizer. We have a positive control, which receives mineral fertilizers, commercial mineral fertilizers at planting, along with 80 pounds of nitrogen per acre, and that's supplemented at V6 with an additional 130 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And these 2 treatments are compared against different rates of litter, 2, 3, 4, and 7 tons per acre. Where again we're showing ear leaf nitrogen concentrations. Anything below the red line is deficient. Anything below the light green line is low. Anything below the dark green line is sufficient, and then anything above the dark green line is high. And what we see here is that the litter even in high application rates, in a couple of years of the study, is not able to supply all of the nitrogen that's needed to produce corn. We see low concentrations in the ear leaves. So it's just again emphasizing that the best approach is to use litter for your corn crop, to apply the starter nitrogen as litter, and then to make sure that you amend that with commercial nitrogen at V6. Obviously, the trifoliate leaf concentrations of nitrogen are sufficient. Again, emphasizing that the litter application in the prior year to corn is not having an effect, a negative effect, for example, in producing soybean in a subsequent year. Obviously, one of the things that we're looking for with litter is to see whether or not we do have uptake of the phosphorus, for example, that's in the litter when we land apply it. And this plot here shows, especially in 2021, that in fact we do have nutrient uptake, phosphorus uptake from litter, and you can see increasing concentrations of phosphorus in litter as we go from 2, 3, 4, and 7 tons an acre in 2021. We've never had any real deficiencies in ear leaf phosphorus concentrations for corn when we were using adequate amounts of litter at planting, and we've never seen phosphorus deficiencies when we're using litter as a fertilizer in a prior year for a soybean crop. Again, this is the same data: plant tissue, ear leaf potassium concentration for corn. Those are shown in yellow. Again, trifoliate leaf potassium concentrations, those bar graphs are shown in green. So obviously we have a corn-soybean rotation going here in the study, and you can see that the litter is able to supply the potassium needs for both the corn and the soybean crops. And remember, the litter is only applied to the corn, not to the soybean. So it's applied to the corn. The next year we have carryover nutrients that are used to produce the soybean. Briefly here, I'd like to show you that we do have uptake of other nutrients other than nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, mineral nutrients in particular from litter. We have good evidence here that we are having uptake of sulfur, for example, from litter, especially in 2021. At plot side A, we see good uptake of sulfur for the corn ear leaf. In particular, the concentrations are significantly higher in the litter application plots than they are in the negative control. Of course, one of the key considerations for the presentation today is mineral nutrient removal rates, and can we use litter to supply those. Here I've got plotted over time basically the grain removal rates for P2O5 for corn and soybean in this rotation, and I can tell you that it's approximately 180 pounds of P2O5 that's removed in a 2-year crop rotation of corn and soybean, and this data here just shows that that's the case. It's somewhere around 100 pounds of P2O5 for the corn crop and somewhere around 80 pounds of P2O5 per acre for the soybean, and that can vary between, let's say, 150 and 180 pounds of P2O5 per acre for a full rotation corn and soybean. And again, here we have the same data for this study where we have a corn and soybean rotation, and you can see that the potassium removal rates that we're measuring are somewhere around 180 pounds of P2O5, or excuse me, K2O per acre, and that would be for a 2-year rotation. And so if we consider the last 2 graphs that we've seen, if we're moving somewhere around 150 or 180 pounds of P2O5 and K2O per acre, and we know that we have 60 pounds of these mineral nutrients in litter, obviously 3 tons of that litter, 3 times 60, would equal approximately what the mineral nutrient removal rates would be for potash and for phosphorus for these 2 crops in rotation. Here we have soil phosphorus concentrations. We collect soil samples every year, and you can see that obviously with a soil test, what we're doing is we're trying to mimic the ability of plants to scavenge nutrients from soil. We use acid extractions to do that. This is Malick 1 extractions, and you can clearly see that as we apply litter in different amounts to these plots to produce corn and soybean in rotation, that we are in fact increasing the concentrations of soil phosphorus. And this is an indication that at the higher application rates, particularly 4 and 7 tons per acre, that in fact what we're doing is we're supplying more phosphorus in the litter application than the plants are using, and hence we have a buildup in soil phosphorus concentrations. I should take a moment to just say that we never want to excessively build up soil phosphorus concentrations, because that is a nutrient that limits algae growth in surface waters, and it does represent a pollution hazard. So once you're firmly in the high, or certainly in the very high test category for phosphorus, that would be the time to switch to just relying on your bank of phosphorus in the soil for future production of corn or soybean in this case. And likewise here we have soil potassium concentrations, and again you can see that the soil potassium concentrations are increasing as our application rates across a couple of different application events here for the corn crops. You can see that the soil potassium concentration is increasing, again indicating that the litter is supplying potassium that will eventually be plant available in the soil. On the last couple of the 3 slides, I want to just emphasize that there's other nutrients that are supplied with litter. One of those that we do have some deficiencies in West Tennessee is boron. You can see here that litter does supply boron, and we know that because we can see that there's significantly higher concentrations of boron in the soil where higher rates of litter are applied. So there is additional value in applying litter for nutrients such as sulfur and boron, and I'm going to show you a couple of other cases where we have direct evidence that other micronutrients are supplied by litter. Here are concentrations of soil zinc, and you can see that litter is clearly supplying zinc to the soil. If you have zinc deficiencies, then litter would be a good choice to address that deficiency. And finally here we have soil copper, and copper concentrations are also increasing as the litter application rate increases, again indicating that litter is a good source of micronutrients for plants. I realize this was a tremendous amount of information that was presented from 2 different studies that we're conducting here at Milan. I'd like to just go over the take-home messages for the study and provide you with my contact information if you have any questions. What we recommend is a split application of litter to a corn and soy rotation. That would be to the corn at planting. That would supply all of the starter nitrogen for the corn and about 2 or 3 years worth of phosphorus and potassium removal in the corn and the soy grain. We have presented you with evidence that litter can certainly supply other plant nutrients, adding value to the litter, those specifically being sulfur, boron, zinc, and copper. And I hope that we've shown that litter is an effective alternative source of certainly mineral fertilizers for corn and soy crop rotation. If you have any questions, I've got listed here my cell phone number. Give that number out to producers. You're welcome to call it at any time. And then if you have any detailed questions, I'd recommend that you send them to my email address, shawkins@utk.edu. Thank you.